Hey everyone, Scott Halverson here, along with my buddy Clint McKinley. How are you, Clint?
Doing great. Hello,
Hey,
Scott.
awesome. Hey everyone, thank you for the great feedback we had after episode one. It's always helpful when you leave a comment, like our YouTube channel, maybe even subscribe. That'd be fantastic if you could do that. Just like any endeavor, we are hoping that you spread the word because we feel like there's some good content not only for you, but for other people to hear. So hopefully that will help. Our commitment to you is very simple. We will level up our game in this format and bring insights and thoughts to you that hopefully you can receive, that you can turn into your own learnings, perspectives, and even some actions. And just as John F. Kennedy said, leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. So that's really what we're all about. How do we get better at leadership? How do we learn? How do we make those two work together? So that's what we're here for in episode two. Clint, you are looking sharp as always, my friend. I'm always impressed with your choice of shirts, wardrobe, and I don't know if you remember this, but in those early days in San Francisco, like we would go shirt shopping, and there was some crazy stuff that we would try. But we even toyed with the idea of starting a YouTube channel that was called Pop and Cuffs because we used to like roll the cuff and it have that design. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
Oh, there it is.
I don't pop them as often anymore. But back in the day, we were popping cuffs and shopping for clothes in San Francisco and trying to look as professional as we could. Those were good memories.
Well, I still think we should have done that channel. But anyway, speaking of clothes, our discussion today is about this amazing story that has great leadership principles. If we go back to the Danish children's parable of the Emperor's New Clothes, which is often cited in a book that you and I love called Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Institute. And I don't know about most of you, but Clint and I have enjoyed careers as entrepreneurs, leaders of small and large organizations, experiencing turnaround challenges, even hyper growth business situations, and everything in between. But ultimately, we can say through personal experience that being at the helm of an organization can often be lonely. It can be non-assuring or non-reassuring. It can be like one of those places where we want to get to, and then once we're there, we're like, ooh, this is a little bit different. Like the dynamics change. This parable really highlights a lot of those different aspects of it. So why don't we just get right into it, Clint? What do you think?
Sure, we'll walk them through the parable. Our topic today being leadership and self-delusion, and pulling from the book Leadership and Self-Deception, as well as from this parable. I look forward to the terrain we're going to cover. So let's dive in right now to this parable from Denmark, The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen. Probably a children's story that many of us remember being taught at a young and impressionable age. But Scott, I think we can both agree this story ages well. So for those of us who may have forgotten the parable, let's dive in and give it a review. So, in this insightful children's tale, a couple of old time scammers visit an emperor who spends lavishly on his clothes. Scott, we didn't spend this lavishly back in the day in
No.
San Francisco. This emperor wanted the best stuff, right? And so he does this at the expense of other worthy priorities in his kingdom. So the visitors that show up to this king in the parable offer to weave him resplendent new clothes with a catch. The clothes are invisible to people who are incompetent. So the emperor agrees, and the would-be weavers go to work. A succession of officials that work for the emperor and the emperor himself visit the faux weavers working away at their looms to check their progress. And each person who checks on these weavers notes that the looms are empty, but each pretends that they can see the clothes in order to avoid being thought a fool by others in the emperor's court. Finally, the weavers tell the emperor that his new clothes are ready to be worn, and they pretend to dress him, and they leave the palace as he sets off in a procession through the whole city. So the weavers are now gone. The emperor believes that he will be able to tell who is competent and incompetent in his kingdom based on how his subjects react. The townsfolk awkwardly go along with his pretense, not wanting to appear stupid until a child finally blurts out that the emperor is wearing nothing at all except his undies. Suddenly, everybody realizes they've been fooled. The emperor is in his underwear. Although startled, the emperor continues with the procession, walking more proudly than ever and doubling down on his own delusion. So, not a very long parable, but layered. There's a lot in there. Let me ask everybody listening today: has anyone ever felt like the child in the story? The one who's like, "Hello, obvious. Can nobody else see this thing that's so clear?" Maybe you can relate to the townspeople, relate to them. Maybe you've had to go along with something or a pretense that didn't feel right to you. How about the emperor's officials going along with the scam, not wanting to be shown up? And how about the emperor himself, right? Or how about the scammers who, by the end of the parable, are on a beach in another kingdom, getting ready to rep off the next emperor? I would say that, with the exception with the scam artists, most of us have probably been each of these people in different scenarios in our life, one way or the other, right? So, Scott, lots we can unpack here.
Well, I mean, we've been in the position of the emperor, we've been the inspectors. I mean, going throughout our career, I think we've experienced different levels of this. And, you know, I think this is really interesting because it's the first time that I'm looking at this story, and maybe you are, from the point of view of the boy, where we're kind of on the outside of it. We're not in the middle of it as, consultants to people who really want growth to happen. And we're just like, that seems pretty obvious. And it's sometimes hard to hear, but it's also like one of those refreshing places sometimes where, like, no, we really want to help people grow. And so it's really interesting in this, like, obvious yet overlooked dynamic. When you have an objective and honest view of an entire situation, sometimes you don't want to take advantage of it because ego, right? Because of positions, like, I'm supposed to have all the answers. But I just think it's really a luxury for most leaders and organizations to have that senior advisor, that outside counsel, that would be really beneficial. It kind of like takes away a lot of the pain that we see in this parable.
Well, there would have been a lot less pain if that kid would have spoken up, or if there had been a consultant in the castle who may have said, "Look, I don't have any political ambitions. I'm here for unvarnished truth, and you, my friend, are in your underwear." And the whole thing could have been stopped. But the emperor didn't hire a consultant. He stuck with the people who had been brainwashed into his delusionary way of operations. And I think we can all relate to that at one point or another.
Totally. So with all the takeaways that are here, like, let's focus our conversation today on self-delusion. And the fact of the matter is, we've all been like the emperor at times in our lives. We believe we're right. We believe others who don't perceive reality our way are the deluded ones. They're the ones with the problem because they're not getting in line with the program. Well, we don't have to be actual emperors, presidents, or CEOs to fall prey to this, right? Uh, Anyone with leadership influence, anyone accountable for the success of a team, no matter how big or small, anyone with influence in an organization of any kind at all, including maybe even family, can learn from this parable. So let's get to the takeaways. Clint, what do you have first?
All right, let's dive in and see what we learn here, Scott. I think that it is easy to notice self-delusion or self-deception in others. It's easier to be the child, but it's very hard to see it in ourselves. After all, we are deluded. And when we are deluded, we project all kinds of confidence that our idea, our strategy, our game plan, our conclusions are correct. And it reminds me of a quote by Bertrand Russell, who once said, "The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts." I say it this way: the wiser we get, the more we know that there is so much that we just don't know. So, a lot more here, but my first takeaway would be, wow, this is hard to self-diagnose.
For sure. But, the longer we get in our careers, the more we realize, oh, this is scary territory. I know a lot, but there's so much more I don't know. So then it becomes like, okay, it begs the question. So how do we get confident without being a fool? And how can we wisely consider intelligent doubts, risks, and threats and still make decisions confidently? I mean, from my experience, the key is to put systems in place to help safeguard against self-delusion. So what does this
Mhm.
actually look like? I mean, practically, right? Uh, returning to the aforementioned emperor and reflecting on our own spheres of influence, what can we learn from his critical flaws and what can we put in play to avoid this kind of self-delusion?
Well, here's another takeaway there, Scott. It seems to me that the emperor's lack of self-esteem led him to create a culture of fear in his castle. His royal advisors did not feel safe enough, being comfortable giving him honesty. They said what he wanted to hear. The fear in the castle had led to survivalist thinking, and the path to advancement was quite literally blind obedience and fealty. So I think this is a good time to bring up a topic called command and control as it relates to leadership, because I think that there's a time when, again, you don't have to be leading a full company or a nation. You can be leading a family. You can be leading a team of entrepreneurs who work with you for the hope of gain, not because they're compelled by a title. There could be a lot of areas where you have a sphere of influence. But when do we bring command and control to leadership versus not? When do we open it up? And I find that if you are in a position of leadership, you set the stage by telling people what kind of meeting it is, what kind of conversation it is. And what I found effective in making decisions and in showing leadership in times where there was the way forward may not have been so certain is to have debating sessions where you call it a debating session, where you name it that, and you invite people to the table to have a debate, to bring your best ideas, and let's have it out. Let's have a very good discussion about options A, B, or C. Now, I usually like to narrow it down to maybe 3 or 4 potential ways to go, so it isn't a massive free for all. But I think erring on the side of opening up in that debating session and being more tolerant of more ideas is the way to go. However, if we have been through debating sessions, or if there's not much more time before a critical decision is made, I would call a decision meeting. That means I'm going to make a decision by the time the meeting's over, and
Like
or
with the
announce it.
same group? With the
Well, it
same
could
group?
be. It could be with the
Okay.
same group. The point is that you just call the meeting different things, so the people who are showing up know what to expect. Like if I say there's a decision meeting, that means I'm coming with a decision. A decision's been taken or will be taken, and there's a different air that we breathe in that kind of a meeting than in the meeting when we say this is a meeting to brainstorm or to get ideas. And if you are the leader of a group or any sphere of influence here, my suggestion would be in the debating session, speak much less. Don't come with all of your ideas, because when you do, or don't speak all your ideas, because if you do, people may politically be inclined to follow them because of your role in the organization rather than to give you what they really think. And so the way to avoid that is to ask the best questions. People sometimes think leaders should have all the answers. I totally disagree. Leaders have the best questions. That's who you know who the leader is in the room. They're
Yeah.
provoking the dialogue, and they're getting the answers out, not through some sort of look at me, I'm smart, I have the answer, but I have really good questions, and I'm confident in the intelligence and the people that are in this meeting to help us solve. However, when I come and say we're taking a decision, and if the leader of the group says, "Here's what we're going to do," boom, gospel goes down at that point, and we know what the North Star now is, and the time for debate is over. And
Yeah.
you can be very smooth in that moment as long as you provided a chance for ideas to be heard. Because Scott, one thing I've learned is people don't always agree with what the leader does, but you can have great organizational culture if everybody feels heard, if their points of views have been recognized, heard out, and perhaps rejected for reasons that the person who brought forth the idea may not even fully appreciate at the time. But if they feel heard and they feel valued, they will go along with the decision if they trust their leadership. And the way that the leadership gets their trust is by listening to them. So it's a bit of a virtuous cycle. So that's one takeaway.
I like that. I mean, I remember when I was a direct report to a president of a company, and we would go through that process, and I really appreciated being part of the whiteboarding process and like bringing opinions in that. And then when it came time for the decision, uh, it was kind of like he was really good in saying, "Okay, clearly this is what we're going to do. This is what we need to execute on." And then at last, he's like, are there any other thoughts? It's like, this was like speak now or forever hold your peace, because that was like critical. I was talking with an executive of a company, just recently, and they're trying to like they've got a very charismatic CEO and they want to elevate him into a really strategic role. And his big problem is like, I need somebody who can say no to this guy. I need somebody who can challenge what's happening, because he goes, right now I just have a lot of yes people. And so they're not growing, they're not innovating, they're not getting better culturally, from an internal perspective. So it's just like whatever the CEO says happens. And there's like, he says it's a little scary because there's comfort in that, but then it's not always the right decision. And like you want people around you who will not only like bring a challenging perspective to get to the best answer, but also know when to fall back into line and say, okay, now we're in execution mode. And I think also in an experience I had working with a very, very young team. And like I was the only one with industry knowledge coming into this. And they're just like, I don't even understand what this is all about. But they would come with some really interesting ideas. They may not have known how to exactly express it in a great way, but I think great leaders figure out a way to let the opinion be heard, to let those like ideas come forth without worrying about how it's done, and worrying that more being confident time will polish all people, as you bring them through that process. So I think there's a lot of discipline, and to your point, be a great listener and ask a lot of questions when you're kind of in the emperor's position. Keeps you from that self-delusion trap.
Yeah, being surrounded by yes people will make you more deluded, not less.
Yeah.
And a big example of this is World War II. The tide is turned against Germany. Adolf Hitler is going quite crazy, and the people around him are yes men. And so when he decided to move his troops from Russia to the Western Front for the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans were already running across Western Europe, as were the rest of the Allies, and we were going for Berlin. And so were the Russians from the eastern flank. And so he moved all of his soldiers over to the Battle of the Bulge just out of pride. The Germans, that the tide had been turned, they were going to lose the war. And he could have surrendered. And a lot of his generals wanted to tell him he was crazy to do the Battle of the Bulge. You're going to lose tens of thousands of German boys and Americans, although they may not have cared, and a lot of civilians, but it's going to be a meat grinder war of attrition of lots of blood and bodies. But the generals knew that if they told the emperor, they would be taken out, because Hitler was very paranoid by then, and the wheels were coming off. And I think we can see this in totalitarian regimes at times. You don't displease the king or off with your head. In a professional setting, the dynamic is similar. If you're surrounded by yes men all the time, you're going to make terrible decisions because they are going to be afraid of offending your ego, and that can lead your company or your organization right off a cliff. So, what takeaways do you have next for us, Scott?
Well, I mean, that kind of leads into the arrogance of the leader, right? The emperor
Yeah,
himself, like, didn't spend the time to develop relationships. He used like this ploy of, here's how I'll know incompetence, and here's how I'll know who's really loyal and can see what is the truth. And so, like, he really like put his ego and his arrogance in front of everything, which I feel is a little bit sad. But, there are ways to not only privately but publicly build trust within an organization, to seek that honest feedback. And I really appreciated times in which I received feedback or I gave feedback and everyone's like, this is great. Like, this is fantastic. And you learn when to build up others and you learn to build trust. And sometimes it's offsite, sometimes it's onsite. It's just a question of like how you do it in the moments of, from a leader's perspective, is seek first those opportunities to build that trust and you will get that back. So it's almost like, it seems very obvious when we talk about those things, but when we have deadlines, when we are like pushed into execution mode all the time, and it's just like every day we got to get so much done, I feel like that hits the back burner when that should be one of the most important things from a leadership perspective up front, so that your calendar, your agenda, and your like modus operandi isn't like get these tasks done first. It's like get my people to a better place all the time.
asking questions and being curious about their answers, this is what I'm getting from what you're saying, is a way to build trust. And it's a way to safeguard moments in your underwear in front of your subjects, for sure.
Yeah, I guess a good
Here-
word for that, just to sum it up, would be like, rather than like telling and getting feedback, it's learn how to counsel with people, learn how to ask good questions and see what they're coming back with, and then really that interaction versus, oh, I'm like leading and they're following. So just a good
Good
summation.
summary.
All right,
Yeah, thank
let's
you for
move
that.
on.
All right, here's another takeaway. The emperor did not vet the weavers. He allowed his trust in them to be swayed by an appeal to his vanity, and he was taken down by his own narcissism. So, what's the takeaway here? Beware of anyone who tries to convince you of something by appealing to your vanity, especially someone you don't know well. People you know well typically won't appeal to your vanity. They might. It's a little bit sneaky. Be on the lookout for that. But what many times will happen is if you are in a leadership role, somebody will flatter you and use that as a way to get themselves liked by you because they're appealing to vanity. And then perhaps you will have a soft spot for listening to them. This is a major red flag. And this parable never gets off the ground if the emperor actually had vetted the weavers, but he didn't. And the weavers knew exactly what this guy's tragic flaw was. It appears because they knew if they appealed to his ability to feel like a cut above and more competent, that's the ticket to this guy's heart. So there's another takeaway.
Well, I mean, think about the ways that that can happen in today's like business environment. Anything that like takes away from interpersonal, relationship, these interactions that happen,
Yeah.
it could be one of those things. I mean, I don't want to get too off on a tangent, but you see how the development of an organization is really hampered when everything is online, when everyone's work from home. It's like so much can be learned from the nonverbal, from how an organization reacts. And I think we're going to see a little swing back to that way. Is like there's not a technology fix for everything. And if that's right, the one thing that, like, say, a weaver is coming with, it's like, yeah, but how does that affect my relationship with my people? If you're looking at internally, if you've got vendors that meet with that interact with your customers, is like, am I just keeping the customers on the sideline, or am I really giving them the service that they need, or do I need a combination of both? And I don't know about you, but I love developing relationships with people that have a broad understanding of the tools in my particular industry. And so if a solution comes, I want to ask them, it's like, hey, have you used this? What do you think? Like, look within your relationships. And I've had really good feedback from people. It's like, you're going to love this vendor. You're going to love this implementation specialist. This is what they do. And that delivers most of the time. So I'm sure you counsel with a lot of people. People ask us all the time, just from our position. So I think it's a great way to have someone even on the outside to say, hey, do you know about this particular aspect? So that the vendors are vetted without, some political agenda, that somebody knows somebody. It's like, no, I'm going to really know if they're good.
Yeah, I think as consultants, part of what we do in our practice is to help uh, better decisions to be made. And many times, just reaching out to a network of people, it doesn't always mean it's a big engagement. Sometimes you and I are called because people are doing their own vetting and they're just, wanting to talk to a trusted voice for half an hour about something that is, perilous for them, or the timing is really intense for their business and their scheduling. And they're just reaching out to a broader group of people and trying to find some children in among the townsfolk, to give some real truth. And we enjoy that. And as executive and other companies, I enjoyed having occasionally very smart consultants around me who, in addition to my team, who were great. The consultants just have a different perspective and a different view into your reality. And you don't always have to do what they say, of course, but hearing their perspective is man, it fills the decision maker up with other data points and just allows you to be wiser. So yes, we see this all the time. What other takeaways do you have, Scott, from the story?
So I also listed the emperor's vanity drove him to prematurely try to show off and like prove his point. So he's just basically grandstanding the whole thing, and he's like, you know what, I'm just gonna double down because this has to work because I've got no other option. So
Ooh.
like this grandstanding to gain attention, to show your position, it leads to magnification of missteps instead of raising your voice, or pursuing the best ideas.
No, it's fair. Very, very fair. The grandstanding will mess you up double. Scott, another quick takeaway related to yours, and I think some other points earlier is that I think his insecurity of the emperor's insecurity, led him to want to classify the intelligence of others and make a show of it. And of course, when he was exposed to having not being very competent, he doubled down, as you mentioned. And I just want to talk a little bit about the word pride here, because I think there's a couple different meanings to pride. We can be proud of a job we do. We can be proud of our children. We can be proud of people in our company who step up and do great things. But there's another kind of pride, which is more dangerous, which I want to address. And this type of pride gets nothing out of having something. It only gets something out of having more of it than the next person. Obsession about the comparison in this way is a cancer to culture and a sign of deep insecurity. Seeking evidence to confirm your dominance is a big form of weakness in an organization. A healthy form of validation can come from asking these questions. For example, do I stand up for my beliefs, but with an open mind that there could be better ideas? Do I value the intelligence of others, or does their superior intelligence make me nervous? Do I want to be the smartest person in the room, or do I want to learn the most in the room? When we are wrong, we can show humility, admit it, and we can course correct. But I like to think about the words of Teddy Roosevelt. You've probably heard this, everybody. Comparison is the thief of joy. And I think he was referring to the comparison of intelligence, natural gifts, talents, beauty, etc., in others, rather than the comparison of ideas themselves in the debate. Comparison of ideas is worthy and necessary. Comparison of personality traits and intelligence and trying to classify people is a very slippery slope down. So there's another one for me, Scott.
I love that. Pride is, while it does have a lot of meanings, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So you have to take pride in your work and your ethic and all of that, but also like pride can lead to your downfall because you just basically think that, I've got a few wins under my belt, I've hit a couple of home runs, and now it's like I'm unstoppable. And that's where that all of a sudden that other edge comes in, and then it's like, oh, it becomes such a negative. I love
Yeah.
pride as a positive, so I get that. Well, all right, shifting gears a little bit. We talked about the emperor, but sometimes when we're not the emperor and we're not the leader of a group, oftentimes we're those officials or those inspectors that are part of that organization. And so I believe there's a little bit of self delusion that can happen within those groups. So obviously, in this parable, those people did not have the courage to stand up and state the obvious. And so, what kind of courage does it take to challenge a leader? What's that line of being able to take that risk, risk your title, risk your position, risk your future? And that's always like a gray area and something that not a lot of people talk about. And I just wanted to like sit on that for just a second because I think they're just as part of the problem as the emperor. It's always easier to point the finger at somebody else, but when you're sitting there going, "Oh my goodness, like I can't believe that situation happens." And I've actually seen that as like a new person coming into an organization where I was kind of blown away in the fact that like if you were new, like nobody gave you credence whatsoever because this pride factor within the community was like however long you've been at this company, that meant you had credibility. Now, there's something to
Mm,
be said for that, but then all of a sudden you get into like, okay, we have a problem to solve, and you go through this, this whiteboarding scenario where you're like, I need some ideas, and people were like, I've got 20 minutes because this is how we've always done this meeting, and everyone just got so used to listening to what the leader came to the meeting with that idea
mm.
session just didn't even exist. And so if you ever tried to come out with that, there was like this weird phenomenon where people would be like, well, we don't do it that way. And I'm like, I understand that, but could we do it that way? It's like, no, we don't do it that way
So
because we've done it this way all the time. Right. So
let
they
me
were
ask
all
you a
this like
question.
group think mentality. Yeah.
Yeah, so question for you in that scenario, if you find yourself in that scenario in a company culture, how do you thaw it
Yeah.
out? What do you do to ask the right questions, or what are some things that people listening can be prepared with to use in situations like this where they might be intimidated to challenge the leader?
Well, I mean, so that was where I think clarifying questions really came into play. And it would be like, help me understand how this is going to achieve the goal that we want, or how does this particular aspect of the business model work so that it drives the next phase. And like I would ask them to map it out quite a bit because I took advantage of the fact that I was like new in the organization and almost like leading them into this idea of like, can you not see where this might be a problem? And I would just keep asking clarifying questions so that they were just like, wait a second, there is something there, which opened up some of that opportunity to then create some ideas. But well, I got to tell you, like having that discipline and having that like ability to manage that fatigue is one of the most difficult things that I ever had to deal with. So the better you get at asking clarification or clarifying questions, in my opinion, I think you're able to not only help others like come off of that, like really close-mindedness, but I think you can also get to a better place to where you can have some collaboration.
Great points. I'll add a couple here to that on the clarifying questions aspect. We can ask if we are debating or deciding at this time. And my team at Ruby
Nice.
Ribbon, my team at Ruby Ribbon started using this on me, and I was like, "All right, we're debating today, right?" And everybody knew what that meant. That meant it was going to be a different kind of meeting. So you can manage up by saying, "Are we debating or deciding?" Another thing you can say is, "Are we looking for solutions, or are we working on a preordained one?" That'll get your manager to respond. Um, or something like this, Scott. I think you and I were discussing this yesterday. I get steps A, B, and C, but I don't get D, E, and F. Can you expand on that for the team? Make them explain it.
Yeah.
Make them connect dots. It's not bad or insubordinate to ask your leader to be have more clarity and to walk you through the entire way of thinking around an initiative or a program or a strategy that they want to launch. And
Yes.
it's very wise to ask, are we debating or are we deciding? Those are just a few other tips. Yeah.
No, I get it because I've been in that where it's like, well, A, B, and C are laid out, and then all of a sudden they're at like J. And like, wait a second, like how does that even get there? And it just like, for them, it's like, well, we've had all this experience and understanding, and what happens is they look over obvious gaps. So I think that's really critical. So yeah, I think those are good ways to influence up, and it's like be curious, but also come with some really good ideas when that opportunity presents itself to say, well, what about this? Have you tried this? And then it can open yourself up to being a contributor and not just saying yes to everything.
Yeah, there you go. So to summarize this last bit, I guess there's a time for command and control, and there's where you just lead and say, "This shall be," and you get decisive. There's also a time to open it up, and wisdom, whether you're the leader or the follower, is to know the difference and to
Yep.
be able to navigate it well. So we said in the beginning, Scott, you mentioned the book by the Arbinger Institute called Leadership and Self-Deception. Maybe we can conclude our podcast today with taking some of the takeaways from this book, which is slightly different than the parable, but there's a lot of the same wisdom here, and we'd be remiss without mentioning this book, which has been very helpful to me and Scott in our careers and in our consulting practice. So, what are some takeaways for you, real quick, Scott, as we transition to our home stretch here on leadership and self-deception, and your takeaways? By the way, it's a short book, everybody. You can read it in an afternoon or a morning. It's not War and Peace. But forewarning, every page is thick and dense with information. So I found myself rereading multiple pages. So Scott, what are some of your takeaways?
Well, I mean, I can just put this to myself. I mean, I've always been a fairly ambitious person, but also wanting to be a team player. And I think ambition is a great thing if it's kept in check, especially if you want to get ahead in your career. And basically, it's just, this pursuit of growing, and like the desires, fine, it's good, it's motivating. Uh, but also just like naked pure ambition has its own pitfalls, as the emperor teaches, so it can get out of control really fast. And I mean, there are some lessons in this that I think, when it comes to understanding not only emotional intelligence but also like really good operational ideas, as far as, how do I go about vetting people from the outside to make my organization work? How do I build relationships with teams so that I'm getting the best response? How do I even do like focus groups to hear from people who are completely outside of my bubble that can be like, that's a bad idea? It's so it's one of those about really developing relationships and trust in order to get to the right place, and not using your ego or arrogance or pride as a leader to exert your dominance. And you started out early by saying, fear was a basic tenet of this leader. And I've I've experienced that many times. And while I'll say fear does get results, uh, for many people in the situation, it's more about just enduring that small little time when you're in the spotlight, because it's going to go away. And that leader doesn't really build a great culture. And I've unfortunately seen it more times than not. And I just always resolve to the fact that I never want to be that kind of a leader, regardless of the results.
Good thoughts, Scott. As I look at the book and think about what it teaches, one of the things, the cases that they make, is that instead of focusing on producing results, many leaders are trapped in the box of distorted thinking. And in that box of delusion, they blame others to justify their own failures. Let me repeat that. In that box
Yes.
of delusion, they blame others to justify their own failures. Ooh, very toxic. They are more into that than they are into getting the best ideas to drive results. They make ideas about people. They supplant ideas with people and personalities. They create the people problems that plague most organizations. The toxic cycle of blame and confirmation bias to further castigate others after we have deceived our own selves and failed to take accountability is a big problem in some organizations. So I would say the book tries to get to the root of this, which is anytime you're trying to blame someone, and gets very tricky, because in a business, we've got to figure out sometimes why something doesn't work, or we're not going to learn from it. And there seems to be a rush to get to that, to get, and I understand why there is one. We want to know as soon as possible, why didn't this work, or why did this idea not deliver? Why did this initiative underperform? Man, we want to be curious and learn, but if we're rushing too much, sometimes blame gets assigned early, and like the knives of politics come out, and et tu brute, right? What's going to happen? I
Yeah.
think this is a dangerous moment, and I think if you're in a position of leadership, you are called upon to be righteous in this scenario. You are called upon to give a proper diagnosis, like a medical doctor would to an ailment, of why this happened. It's not about personalities. It's not about people. Sometimes people have to be accountable, and you have to call that out. But it's more about the idea and why the idea didn't work. And we have to be able to distinguish between what we decide to do and the person who came up with the idea. And this is where the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater quite a bit. Oh, this is Scott's idea. And then everything negative about it is stapled to you. and
Yep.
we can just throw you into the river and continue on our cruise, you know. um, or people like to use this phrase in business, throw me under the bus. I'm so sick of that phrase, but it gets said so much. And this is the time that this stuff happens. So if you're in a position of leadership, you know what to do here. When you're pointing one finger, you know you have three or four fingers pointing back at you. Look in the mirror, get out of that box of deluded thinking, and work for results, which you know is about ideas, not about personalities. So I'll give a quick example of this. I was at a conference last year, Scott, and Andy Fastow was speaking, who was the CFO of Enron.
Yeah.
And he was the CFO during the heydays with Kenny Lay, and you know, they were doing big deals, and they had fancy glossy annual reports with big pictures of the mighty Ken Lay. And one of his enablers was Andy Fastow, as CFO. He worked very closely with the lawyers, and he did all those deals. I spoke with Andy Fastow after he was released from 12 years of prison
Wow.
for being a key player in one of the biggest frauds ever perpetrated on the American population in terms of investments. And in one hand, he held his CFO of the Year award, and in his other hand, he held his Federal Bureau of Prisons ID card. And what he told us is that every deal we did at Enron was technically okay. Like, there were legal loopholes stitched to legal loopholes stitched to legal loopholes to make those deals technically legal. But most of them violated the actual spirit of the law that they were getting around. Every last one of them, if you said it on a first reading to a lawyer, would say illegal. But if we do this and this and this and this, we can create a sideshow over here and interpret the law in a more elastic way, and do all of these loophole deals. And he said in his trial, he had all the Enron deals stacked up on the counter, and he said every last one of them I felt was technically accurate, but every last one of them violated the spirit of the law. And I think that, to me, is in the box distorted thinking. Those Enron executives were deluded, and Andy Fastow knows it now. And he did a great deal of spiritual work and healing in prison, and he shared those stories with us. And it's a magnificent story to listen to him speak today. And I give Andy Fastow all the credit in the world for his repentance and his courage to speak about ethics now. But what a story. And it's almost like Enron came after this book came out, but it would have been a case study for leadership and self-deception.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you think about that. And like the courage that he had, right? To even have that, but realizing, okay, I've made a mistake and I can change. It's like, you know, when you're stuck in that box of delusion and blame, I think we need to remember that, the emperor doubling down in his effort, was not very productive. And even though he's like sitting there in his undies, returning to those safeguards that they could have had in place could have changed the whole dynamic. And so, like, as a leader, and before we find ourselves parading before our peers, like at our skivvies, right? Please know that, like, we have the ability to course correct. We really do. I mean, it's not the last act. It's not the final, project that you're doing. Maybe you were duped along the way. Maybe you made a bad decision. Maybe you didn't listen to alternative voices, but you can sit there and just take a moment back, look at it and be like, you know what? We need to course correct. So,
Mhm.
as you become aware of the self delusion and what it causes, you need to be compassionate with yourself. We've all been down that road. We've all paraded in our underwear before. And it's, sometimes we feel like this is the way, but these career episodes and lessons are a part of growth and learning and development. And as time passes, we learn from these experiences. They become very pivotal. Sometimes you can laugh about it and become entertaining as you tell stories. It's like, you remember when we did that? It's like, yeah. Or remember when we had that mistake? It's like, yes. But like, you find out that people give grace, people realize, okay, there's room to fight again. So it leads to these amazing comeback scenarios, and getting unstuck and being curious and not getting sucked into your own delusion and taking ownership for what you're in charge of is a key to any leadership. So apologize sincerely when needed. Be
Mhm.
curious, be humble, be hungry at the same time, committed to like this learning and excellence. As we said, leadership and learning are indispensable. That's how that goes. And we have this under this umbrella of compassion and empathy for everyone in our organization that we touch. I think if we do this, and if you do this personally, if you're listening, you will emerge as a wise and far less deluded leader moving forward, and people will respond accordingly. So that's kind of one of my big takeaways from that. So, any other thoughts, Clint?
I'll just highlight something small that you said in there among many smart things there. I would say that curiosity for me reigns more or less supreme if you want to get over some of these problems of deluded thinking. True intellectual curiosity is a panacea to many problems, and it can be a panacea to self-delusion. And I would just encourage everybody to Adam Grant says that when we find out that we're wrong, there's a couple of ways to react. One of which is, wow, I'm learning something today. And to be curious and excited about learning, as we talked about in our previous episode. And I think if we greet each day with a level of intellectual curiosity, I wonder what I'm going to learn today. You can
That's
be
pretty
set up to
cool.
handle you can be set up to handle moments like this with a lot more grace and deftness and professionalism, and you can arrive at a better state of leadership. So that's a takeaway for me. Stay curious.
Stay curious, surround yourself with great people that don't say yes all the time. Get a bunch of people that you can confide in, and I think a lot of decisions will be far easier as long as you keep your pride in check. So that's really good. Well, I hope you all have enjoyed this podcast, and thank you for taking time to invest in your own leadership perspectives. And we hope it helps you become a better leader, a better advisor, a better team player, maybe a better parent along the way. And most importantly, we hope that you become a better human being through this process. If you need to reach out to us, you have any further questions, we're at hmrevenuerepair.com. Either Clint or Scott, we're happy to answer any questions, comments, any challenges you're facing that are keeping you from hitting your goals and your targets this year. So we appreciate you spending some time today with us, and we look forward to helping you out again and sharing our perspectives on leadership and growth. So thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.